Today, we bring you the first part of our global broadcast exclusive conversation.
The streets of Tahrir have once again been filled. People are chanting against Shafiq, chanting against the government.
Key issues here at the United Nations Climate Change Conference remain unresolved, including the future of the Kyoto Protocol.
The forests of central India and the protesters in Wall Street are connected by a big pipeline.
Kenneth Chamberlain, the 68-year-old veteran, fatally shot by police in his own home.
He was proud to be a Marine.
At every block, police are saying to the protesters to move further and further away.
I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now! "45 years ago, on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. He'd gone to Memphis to help sanitation workers organize a local of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, Local 1707. It was in the evening. He was on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel when he was gunned down. 1 year to the day before, on April 4th, 1967, he gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York. His inner circle of advisors, many said, "Don't do this," as he gave a speech that came to be known as Beyond Vietnam. They said, "You have turned around the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States. You've gotten him to support the Voting Rights Act. You've gotten him to support the Civil Rights Act." They were talking about Lyndon Johnson. Why would you alienate him now? But Dr. King saw it all as a seamless web. And so he spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And he said his country, the country he loved, the United States, was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. After this speech, Time magazine called the speech demagogic slander that sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. The Washington Post said King, quote, diminished his usefulness to his cause, his country, his people. You know, Danny Glover once joked in the last few years that if Dr. King were alive today, he would not be invited to any of the celebrations of his life. That was more than 40 years ago, 46 years ago. Where is the press today? You know, this is the 10th anniversary of the war in Iraq, when the U.S. invaded Iraq on March 19, 2003. 6 weeks before, Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, the general, gave his speech at the United Nations, his push for war. It was the final nail in the coffin of so many. It was a speech he would later call a stain on his career. The organization FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, did a study of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving that address before the world body. And they looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts and the number of interviews they did. This is around the time when about half the population was for the war and half the population opposed to war, 6 weeks before the actual invasion. They looked at NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, and the PBS NewsHour. In that 2-week period, there were 393 interviews done around war. So with about half the population for and against the war, how many do you think were with anti-war leaders? 200, maybe 150. No, the fact was 3. 3 of almost 400 were anti-war leaders. This is no longer a mainstream media. It's an extreme media beating the drums for war. I really do think that those who are concerned about war, those who are deeply concerned about the growing inequality in this country, those who are concerned about climate change, about the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. We need a media that is not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers when we talk about war, not brought to us by big pharma, by the insurance industry when we talk about healthcare, not brought to us by the oil and gas and coal companies or the nuclear companies when we talk about climate change. We need a media that's brought to us simply by listeners and viewers and readers who are committed to hearing and listening to and watching something brought to us through something other than a corporate lens or microphone. You know, how do we know about the world? Either we come from another place or a friend or a family member does. Most often we learn about it through the media. It's got to be through something other than a corporate lens. And most importantly, the rest of the world has to learn about us through an independent lens. That is a matter of national security. So, 10 years ago, we talk about this study, the FAIR study. 10 years later, on the 10th anniversary, Democracy Now! How many of you listen to or watch or read Democracy Now! And I hope you tell your friends about it. And we're now on over 1,100 radio and television stations around the country and around the world. And it's because of people like you who put the public back in public media and demand different kind of programs that bring you something other than what we get on all of the networks, that small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. Instead, we have to go to the heart of the story, to the people themselves on the ground who are the experts in their own communities. I think that's why Democracy Now! Is news with a heart and actually is hopeful, because the people who are analyzing situations are the people who are actually, no matter how desperate those situations are the people who are doing something about them. The week of the 10th anniversary of the war in Iraq, we started with Arundhati Roy, giving us an outside perspective from the South about where we stand today. And then we moved on to something I didn't think was particularly revolutionary when we're talking about a war in another country. It's people from that country talking about what it means to be at the target end of U.S. foreign policy. We had Raed Jarrar, who is the Iraqi-American blogger. We had Yanar Mohammed, the Iraqi feminist, talking about what has happened on the ground, especially for women in Iraq. And we brought you another casualty of war. Of course, the people of Iraq first and foremost, but then we're talking about the U.S. soldiers who have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. More than 1 million people have served, and we brought you Thomas Young. How many of you have heard or met Thomas Young? He was a young soldier who was sent to Iraq. Couldn't quite understand why he was sent to Iraq. He signed up 2 days after the 9/11 attacks. He thought he would be sent to Afghanistan, and then he was sent to Iraq, and within 5 days, he would be paralyzed. He was sent to Sadr City. It was April 4th, 2004, the same day that Cindy Sheehan, one of the leading peace activists' sons, Casey Sheehan, was killed in that same place. She always talked about 40404. Well, Thomas Young wasn't killed, but he was shot by a sniper. He came back, was treated at Walter Reed, went through rehabilitation, was paralyzed, became a leading spokesperson against the war in Iraq, was involved with Iraq veterans against the war. But his health took a great turn for the worse, had a pulmonary embolism in 2008, and now, like so many soldiers, He is deciding whether to take his own life. Is it possible that we live in a country where 18 soldiers or veterans a day commit suicide? I mean, it is an astounding figure from the Pentagon itself. And the number of soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, almost one a day. And here is Thomas Young. We sent a camera crew into his house in Kansas City with his wife, Claudia Cuellar. And he talked about how he can't live with the pain anymore. And so he is deciding whether or not he will take his own life in the next few months. In our studio was Phil Donahue. Phil, who did a film about Thomas, 7 years ago, but has remained in touch, a film called Body of War, Thomas Young's Body of War. Phil Donahue, who had the flagship show on MSNBC on the eve of the invasion. It's an amazing story. A network that even went against its own financial interests, but right before the invasion, he was summarily dumped. Why? Well, a memo came out from NBC, it had been kept secret before, that said they didn't want an anti-war face on the flagship show of their network when the other stations, the other networks were waving the American flag. I can't think of a broadcaster who was more of a patriot than Phil Donahue before the war, as he brought on the voices of people who were raising serious questions about the most serious decision a country can make, whether to go to war.